Primarily because, as some of you know, I actually am a scientist. I do research at the University of Toronto, and I have my own, I have a research lab, and I, run with several students and people working for me. And I am a Spiritist speaker. So at the same time, I think it's one of the most interesting topics that I find, that I can talk about and hopefully shed some light to some of you. So today I wanted to bring something a little bit different from what you normally see regarding this topic. So the question mark contradiction, I think all of us know the answer, that there's actually no contradiction in that. We know that. It's not really my point here to go back in history too much and talk about where the contradiction started and how it kind of resolved recently, but rather than doing that, I'll go through some of the key interesting figures that were participated in figuring out why the contradiction does not exist in the first place. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about the scientific aspect of Spiritism and how does that explain some of the trouble we had in the beginning, reconciling faith and science. So let's get started. First of all, talking about faith. So if we go back and try to understand what is faith, there are two main concepts that arise. So the first concept is believing. So that comes from the Greek etymology, and that represents the understanding that if I have faith in something, I believe in that, independently of what it is. So that's why in the end of every sentence in many religions we end with amen, which is like I trust, I believe in what I'm saying. And in many Spiritist centers we're going to end the prayer saying that, so be it, which is another alternative way of saying the same thing. So whatever I'm saying, like, may this be happen because I believe this will happen. So believing is one part of it. But there's another section of the faith definition which not a lot of people pay attention to, and actually means abiding by something. So in other words, like if I have faith in God, actually I do have to not only believe but act in a way that supports what he's telling me to do. So if I have faith in God, I have to follow his laws. That's one of the definitions of faith too. So if I have faith in someone, in other words, I not only believe in his actions, but I will try to do the same. I'll try to follow the direction that I've been, that's part of my faith. So faith is not only the act of believing, but also the act of doing something in support of that cause. So there's two interesting definitions of faith. And we're going to discuss those two aspects of faith during the few minutes that we're going to talk about today. So Allan Kardec, or Hippolyte Rivail, professor that you see in the picture there, one of the most remarkable quotes from everywhere in his publications, books, and history, is that unshakable faith is that which can stand face to face with reason in all epochs of humanity. And that's so important because if we go back to 1850s, when 1830s, when he started actually his work trying to develop and understand what Spiritism is for us today. Remember that Spiritism, even as a word, did not exist before him, right? Just like Christianity did not exist in Christ's epoch. We're talking about movements that started and then were categorized afterwards, and now we can refer to it. So he was trying to reconcile in his own mind what we're talking about today. And that's why he brought the word reason and unshakable faith. So faith and reason, the same sentence, which is something that if you try to do that before the 1600s, like I would say before the 18th century in general, you probably be burned alive if you try to come up with that. And many people in history that brought up that idea, not only in Christianity, by the way. So every single religion in the world today that we know have been through some times and periods where reason and faith somehow collided and had to be brought together. And we're going to talk a little bit about it too. So that's exactly what he's trying to do. It's like, listen, I'm bringing you this body of knowledge that is primarily based on faith in something that I cannot see, but I know it's intelligent and created the universe. That's God. But at the same time, I'm doing it using my reason. And we're going to, if you think back, that's quite strong, because he's actually thinking. And he's getting to conclusions, not because someone's telling him to do, or because that's his bias when he started his studies. That's quite the opposite. He reasoned about everything he's done, and we're going to give you examples of that. And then in the end, he concluded that whatever was happening was based on an intelligence that cannot be seen, so those are the spirits. And all the information coming from those spirits at that time were coming from another source that he later on described in the first question of his book as God. Right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So, if we go to his own works now, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, I just highlighted a few areas here. So, this is what he says about blind versus rationalized faith. From the religious point of view, faith comes from the belief in the special dogmas which constitute the religion. So in other words, like there's a dogma, there's something that really cannot be explained directly. There's a set of laws that you believe, so that's faith. All of them have their articles of faith. From this aspect, faith may be either blind or rationalized. So blind faith examines nothing and accepts without verification. Right? So that's what blind faith is. You believe, but you actually don't think about it. Right? I would even consider that blind faith doesn't even exist. Because you cannot call faith, really, if it's completely irrational and blind. It's not faith, you're just following without thinking. So it's completely unsubstantiated. Right? And if you go to the bottom here, he says, only faith that is based on truth guarantees the future, because it has nothing to fear from the progress of enlightenment, seeing that what is true in obscurity is also true in light. It's quite interesting. So it doesn't matter which situation you are, and that's what he's saying. It doesn't matter which religion you follow. It doesn't matter which country you live in. It doesn't matter anything. Faith that's based on intelligent reasoning will withstand anything. And that's what he's saying there. It doesn't matter the obscurity or light. Even if you get more information in 100 years from now, that new information can easily be incorporated into what we believe in faith today. Because if your faith is based in reasoning, it doesn't matter when you're going to do it again. And if you add more information to it, it's still reasonable, and it's still thinking, and it's still rational. Okay? So each religion claims to have possession of the exclusive truth. But for someone to proclaim blind faith on a point of belief is to confess themselves impotent to demonstrate that they're right. And I think that's a remarkable statement and I'll explain that, what he says, that everyone claims to be right. Yeah, I'm not saying about religion, see, anyone, most of the time. We tend to think that we're right first, and then we realize that we're wrong. That's a standard procedure for all of us. It's very difficult to accept that we fail. We're trained to do so since we're born, right? Unfortunately, the way we're brought into this world nowadays forces us to excel, accept, and be perfect all the time, from babies. So religions are, in a sense, a reflection of our own imperfections. So if our only perfection is to think that I'm correct all the time, so I'll transport that into my religion for sure. Because the religions in general are a collective agreement of people. So that's what people believe and follow. So that's a religion. So what he's saying is that if you proclaim to be the exclusive bearer of truth, but you cannot rationalize that, so that's empty. that demonstrates that just that point alone will demonstrate that you're actually not right. Because for you to be correct, you have to withstand any type of questioning from anyone, and you have to be able to discuss it. So I'll give you one example. It happened in Muslims. It happened in Catholic faith. At many times in history where scientific evidence would dispute a claim from a dogma from the religion, people will burn the books. Get rid of it. Don't read it. It's evil. Why? It's quite obvious. Because there's no rational way to contradict what's found in the book based on my own assertion of truth. So the religion cannot withstand the scientific merit of the findings. And that's what makes faith empty. That diminishes it. That takes away the core essence of faith, which is believing, but not only believing, is acting in a way that you show that you believe. Is truly believing. And being able to discuss that with anyone at any time. Not converting people, but understanding what that is. And moving that into your own life. So if you tell me that you have faith in God, so you sure have to be trying at least to do what God is telling you to do. So that is the proof of faith. Right? Remember the difference between believing and actually acting in a way that you show that you believe. Right? There's two aspects of faith. So Leon Denis wrote something quite interesting too on Here and Hereafter. He said that faith is man's confidence is in his destiny end. It is the sentiment that urges him toward the infinite power, or that's representation of God. It is the certainty of being on the road to truth. Blind faith is the lantern whose red glare cannot overcome the fog. And that's a nice way of putting it, because that's exactly what it is. If you don't really understand your faith, and you think about it. So what I want you to do is actually think about what you believe. Why you believe in it. We here have tools to help answer you some of those questions. And everywhere. We're not the bearer of the sole truth of the universe, because the truth is coming from God. All we're doing is working together towards His own plan for us, right? But if you have trouble understanding aspects of your faith, then you're carrying this little lantern that cannot light your own path. You're lost. You're in a fog. That's exactly what Leon Denis is saying. Enlightened faith is the electric searchlight which throws a bright beam over the road ahead. So by the time you understand your own faith, your own beliefs, and you're able to really rationalize and understand why you believe, this incredible path of light opens up ahead of you. Because you don't have now to waste your time trying to figure out what's true, what's not, where you're going or not, what people are telling you it's true or not. You already know. Like, you just go on that path. So Leon Denis writes in a really interesting way, giving you examples along the book. So that's a great book, by the way, Leon Denis, right? And then he writes one more time in the same book, Here and Hereafter. To attain perfection, faith must rest on the solid basis of free examination and liberty of thought. And that's the number one thing that science tells us. So why is this different from science? The basic principle of scientific approach is that you should be able to freely observe, come up with hypotheses, and we're going to talk about this, test them, and report a result. You're free. You really have the liberty of thought. You can think about anything along the process as long as you substantiate your thoughts. And this is instead of a dogma and a mystery, it must recognize those principles that depend upon direct observation and study of natural laws. Such is the nature of the spiritualistic faith. At that time, Leon Denis, the term Spiritism was not coined yet. So they're working, that's why you don't see Spiritism in many of Leon Denis' writings at that time. Okay? So, the opposite of that is think about rationalism. So you have rationalism and you had faith. That was the description we're talking about. And then I really like this quote by Albert Einstein when he talks about rationalism. And this is what he says: "I have not found a better expression than religious for the trust in the rational nature of reality that is, at least to a certain extent, accessible to human reason." So what he's telling us is that if you really reason and you look at reality around us. So I'll give you one example we're going to talk about in a minute. But when Newton looked at the apple falling straight down the ground, that was an observation, right? He was puzzled by it. It was like 1666. So the apple falls down, he looked at it and, hey, wait a minute. There's something pushing this apple or pulling this apple towards the ground. There's an observation. That's the reality. So he was able to reason that, and now he believes so much in it, he proved it mathematically, that new truth that arises from that moment, Albert Einstein calls that, it's almost religious. I believe. It's like a rational faith in a law that he just described. So that's what Einstein's telling us. He said, when we look at natural laws and things that are happening around us, we can prove that they exist and they actually govern the universe. That's almost a religion in itself. And that's not different from what we're doing here today. We're getting this lots of input around us from Spiritist communications, from books, from different religious sources and different philosophies. We're bringing all that together into this understanding that God is perfect. God created everything that exists. And he created the laws that govern the universe. And those laws are being figured out by people like Albert Einstein, for example. Right? So that's exactly what we're doing. So what's the difference between science and religion? Not that much. Because in the religion, I think they overlap more than anyone thinks. Because my religion, I firmly believe in so many things. But at the same time, I rationalize about everything I believe. So I'll give you one example. I'll give you an experiment now. So, it just moved to the next slide. One second. Yeah. So I'll give you one example. So, if I tell you that I believe that my mentor is actually changing the slides, how do I test that? That's my hypothesis. So it's very simple. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to wait for the slide to change. I know he's not going to play that on me today. No. So he's not going to do it. But so my hypothesis just failed. So I'll come back here. So I just proved, rationalizing that right now I'm the one actually changing the slides, not my mentor, not anyone else here. Right? So it's a very simple observation. So I'll tell you what Kardec did. So Kardec, he didn't like the idea of the moving tables at all. He said, the first quote he had from everything related to Spiritism was that unless you show me that the table has a brain, he can actually think, and it can actually move on its own, then I don't think that those are real. I don't think that that's worth my attention or my efforts. And then after many other attempts to bring him into the seances or the meetings that people had around tables, he comes one day and he's shocked to realize that while everyone was paying attention on the ability of the tables to figure out what's the age of someone seated around the table, he was actually much more in depth, and he was thinking, and listen, the movement is the secondary part of all this. What's important on this moving table is actually it's intelligent. It recognizes what we think and responds in an intelligent way. So he devised experiments to test that. So that's an observational study, right? That's actually quite scientific. We do that for all different sorts of populational studies. We still do that same type of approach. In psychology, we use several different ways. Nowadays we develop other approaches, but in general lines, the principle is the same. So what he did, he asked everyone to step away from the desk. That's the first obvious idea. So don't touch the desk. Maybe someone is moving the desk. The desk moved. So the next approach was like, maybe because the table might be too too easy to move. It's just light enough that, any manipulation with wires. And so not only that, he put like this a ton of weight on top of the desk, and see, now it's not going to move. It moved again. It moved with weight or no weight exactly the same way. So the physical weight on top of the table was irrelevant to whatever was moving that table. So that's the second experiment. And then he thought, maybe what we should do is that I'll try to play a trick on this table, and we're gonna ask an age of someone, but we're gonna give the wrong answer. So that's what they did. So they would ask for the table to figure out the age of a specific person, and the table tapped like 48 times, and some of the people in the room said, no, that's wrong, that person's like 47. And then the person would say, actually, that's quite correct, I gave you all the wrong numbers, I'm actually 48. So it stunned everyone, because not only the table was only responding to the people, but it was able to read into the minds of people, even if they don't say the answer. No one knew the answer. And then then Kardec got really interested on this. That's when, if you remember the first sentence by Kardec, unshakable faith is the one that could withstand reasoning at all times. So he developed a systematic approach to evaluate the intelligent aspects of the table's moving. Right? And that's what we're studying today. That evolved into Spiritism. But along the way, he was rationalizing in a very specific pattern of what was true and what was not and what was happening. I'll give you another example. Why do we have 1,094 something questions in the Spiritist book? Well, how are they curated? How are they selected? That was like an enormous amount of work from over I don't know exactly how many countries now, but he received communications from dozens of countries, some hundreds of Spiritist centers, some of them with the same answers. And there was an approach, and you can read that in the Spiritist magazine that's described, not today's magazine, but the ones from the 1850s. And he describes how he would compare and contrast answers, see if they were actually answering exactly the same information in two different parts of the world, received at the same time. So where was that information coming from? It wasn't from me or from Joe. It was coming from a higher source. And then that's what he says later on, that all religions, Albert Einstein says later on, all religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree. So listen. And we're talking about one of the most well-known scientists in the universe. And he's saying something that we firmly believe in. Religions, arts, and sciences, they're branches from the same tree. That's exactly what it is. In a scientific approach, I use all these techniques to figure out if a cell survives or not, and a cancer cell survives the treatment or not. But I can use exactly the same approach to figure out whether a communication is coming from a spirit or not. That's what Kardec did. All these aspirations are directed toward ennobling man's life, lifting it from the sphere of miracle physical existence. See, Albert Einstein is so dramatically correct in everything he says, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're combining religion and science to make us better. Is that different from Spiritism telling us? That's the summary of what Spiritism is trying to tell us, the same thing. That's what Christianity, that's what Jesus Christ told us in the very beginning. What is the moral path of the human being? Remember that. He gave us a set of laws or rules. Help your neighbor. Be a better person. That's exactly what we're doing. All these aspirations are directing towards making us better. So it's getting us away from the physical matter, and that's what Kardec did. He didn't care about the tables. People are so focused on how things move, or how taps occur in walls. Look at the Fox sisters in the United States. Like moving things, tappings in the walls. That's all irrelevant. The important is the intelligence behind those effects. And that's what Kardec studied. And it is leads the individual towards freedom in every aspect of life. Intellectual freedom, moral freedom. Remember when people evolve, when you're a little kid, like a very small kid, like, you know, like Daniel, 3-year-old, he doesn't know exactly the set of rules that society created for living together. So he would do things that, you know, we have to keep telling him, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. Societies evolved the same way. So in very early societies, you know, the rules had to be enforced quite dramatic. First of all, there were no rules. And then there were rules, but they had to be enforced in a very dramatic way because people don't follow them. And then society evolves to a place where you don't even need the rules anymore because the rules are just part of who we are. So that's where freedom is. Freedom only occurs when the rules are so embedded inside your core that you don't need anyone to tell you what to do because you already know. We're far away from that. Right? So we're still on the step of evolution as society that rules have to be enforced quite dramatically. And I'll give you an example. You're driving on a KW and you see a police car. What do? Slow down. Yes, because you're driving above the speed. Yes. Right? So that's a perfect example to show us that we still need that. We're not free. We still need a very defined set of rules. Okay? But that's exactly what Albert Einstein is telling us, is that at some point we'll understand so well what is, you know, what's religion, what's science and arts, and all those together will make us all be free. Because by that time, our faith is not the type of faith that I keep telling people that I believe. It's a type of faith that I don't need to say anything. I believe because I do. That's real faith. You don't need to tip up. You don't need to say, "Hey, I believe in God." We actually get to a point that no one needs to say that anymore. You believe in God. You're following the natural laws. You're following the divine laws. Why do you have to say you believe in God? You're doing exactly what you believe. So we're getting there, and Einstein got into, and that's exactly what we're talking about too in Spiritism. And you know, and as I mentioned, this is Newton there. Every scientific approach starts with a question or an observation, right? So when I had the little experiment here that I moved away and I was trying to figure out with the slide was going to move, that's a very basic approach to a question, scientifically, right? So Newton did the same thing when the apple fell down the floor and he looked at it. It's like, listen, there has to be something that's attracting this apple towards the ground, and he proved it mathematically. So he had a hypothesis that something is attracting the apple. He proved it by mathematical equations. And then he decided whether his hypothesis was true or false. He was able to replicate it. So he said, my hypothesis is true. And he reported the results. And now we have the laws of gravity, right? And Newtonian laws in general. But this individual here that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to spend some time talking about him, he revolutionized Western philosophy, and not a lot of people know about him. When we think about philosophy, we think about the old people, like you think about Aristotle's and things, and that's fair. All of them were inspired by them, but at some given point in time, there were individuals that really changed the way we live in society, and we don't even know about it that much. So, Thomas Aquinas, that's a great example. As we all know, he's a Catholic saint. But an interesting part of his story is that he was born and raised in Italy near Naples, and with a wealthy family. He used to live in a castle. You know, he had literally everything in life. So it's quite different from a lot of other saints figures that we remember in history. So he was when he was in his teenager years, he went to study at the Naples University at that time when it was starting up. And remember, this is in the early 1200s, so this is like 1230 something. Okay, and he went into classes of philosophy, and he studied the Greek philosophers, the old, philosophy. But he, at that time already, he was paving his way to join the Catholic Church. So he came with an interesting way of questioning his own faith. That's exactly what we're discussing today. And he was really the master of trying to come up with an explanation that will answer both his questions from the church aspect point of view and from the scientific point of view. So what he wanted to know in the beginning is that, what does exactly I need to do to go to heaven? So that was the first question, which is very biased towards the understanding of the Catholic Church, which is fair. But then he moved on and he started thinking about, does God exist? Needless to say, he was really, he had a huge pushback from the church at that time, because no one would really allow that type of rational thinking at that time inside the church, because people would see that as a threat. But he came with 5 arguments to support the existence of God. And this is, again, 1200s. Right? So the first one, the argument of there's a classical philosopher, right? So he starts with a question, he develops a hypothesis, and he tries to rationalize the answer to that first question. So the argument of the unmoved mover. So it's very simple. So if you believe that everything in the universe that's moving started at some point, stopped. It was stopped, parked at some point, and then if you see a cloud moving, for example, at some point in time, like there's this external force that pushed the cloud. If you see a ball rolling, someone kicked it, probably, right? So if you see the universe developing, something has to have kick-started, or the unmoved mover. Someone had to have pushed the universe to start. So that's a reasonable way of proving that God exists. He also thinks about the argument of the first cause, or the first efficient cause. So for everything that's efficiently developing, there has to be something that happened before that allowed, the efficient development of the universe. That's the same idea. So the argument from contingency, which is they're all surround the same idea. For example, so if you believe that nothing creates itself, so he's observing. So all he's doing is sitting and observing nature around him. Everything in nature he can observe has to be created by something. So if you extract that information and move it into the universe level, the same rule applies. Right? So the argument of degree, for example, if you believe there's several degrees of goodness in the universe, it has to be 0, and it has to be the perfection. And the perfection is God. Quite straightforward, right? But not to everyone. It took a few hundred years for people to realize how correct he was. And the theological argument, which is, everything in life has a purpose and is bound to evolve. Everything. Even a rock. A rock starts as a lava rock, which is ugly looking, black, high temperature type of rock. It kind of rolls down, goes in the water, like millions of years rolling and moving and doing all. It turns into like a nice, beautiful piece of rock that you put in your home, for example. It turns into mountains. It generates life. So everything in the universe, even our planet, is constantly evolving and has a purpose. Right? And if that's the case, if the purpose is to get better, we'll get better towards God, which is the source of everything. Right? So another interesting aspect of his life, he was the first individual to recognize that a lot of the knowledge at the time came from non-Christians. It's obvious, right? But at that time it wasn't. So, for example, one of his good collaborators, or they used to write together and comment each other's books. He was a Muslim, and I'm just trying to remember his name. I just would like a little note because I knew I was going to forget his name. I'll remember at some point. So, this individual, he was a philosopher among the Muslims, but he was around the same time as Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic Church. He was doing the same thing. He was questioning, why certain rules in his own religion were contradictory to science at that time. And he developed this interesting approach, saying something that's quite similar to what Allan Kardec said. Is that, if you really believe, if you have a true faith, that faith has to be equal, at least reasonably discussed with science at any given time in history. And of course, there was a huge pushback from their side to that, right? He was the first one to write that there are two sets of laws: natural laws and divine laws. For anyone that study Allan Kardec's basic books, have you ever heard about this? Divine laws and natural laws? Isn't that a whole chapter of that? So Thomas Aquinas was the first one actually to describe that. Exactly how we study Spiritism today. So it proves to us that information is coming from this source, which is God, and is just delivered in specific ways around the universe to help us get better. And he was the first one also to say that the natural laws are bound or like a sub-category of the divine laws. Those are the perfect laws that rule the universe. I'll give you one example. Stephen Hawking, for example, many times told us that gravity is what created the universe. I don't disagree with him. I just think that gravity, who created the law of gravity? I'm pretty sure the planet itself did not create the law of gravity. I think the law of gravity governs how all the universe relates to each other, every single body, including ourselves. And that's a good example of a natural law that's just underneath the divine law. That's a perfect law created by God. So God does not play dice with the universe. That's another thing that Albert Einstein says, and misquoted many times by many people. But what he's saying is that the most amazing thing about the universe, it's quite comprehensible. There are very well-defined set of laws that rule the universe. And that's what they're studying. That science is helping us dramatically figure those out. That does not take away in any second from God, creation. Right? And it's quite obvious. So do you think God, being this perfection, he's the representation of perfection, will be playing around and say, "Oh, Joe, I don't like the way your hair is today, so, I'm just going to move it." No, God's not going to do that. He's not going to be interfering with because the creation is perfect. So if you believe that God is interfering with perfection, with the creation, so you're actually going against the principal rule of God, which is that he's perfect. So if God is perfect, his rules are perfect, the laws are perfect, and the creation is perfect. In other words, it has to grow on its own terms, set of rules. So he creates the rules, and the rules govern the universe. It's quite simple. And what are the rules? Laws of gravity, so many physics laws that govern the universe and how the bodies interact with each other. There are the moral laws, right? I have to do good to others. So there's all the sets of laws that are created by our Creator. It's quite easy to understand. But unfortunately, for hundreds and hundreds of years, people had a lot of trouble trying to figure it out. Why? Because for what we don't know, particularly in the past, but what we don't know, we come up with extraordinary ways of explaining it, which is not very scientific. And then that turns into a dogma. And then the dogma cannot be changed, because if I change the dogma, then my faith is bound to a dogma, not to truth. So if I change the dogma, then my faith collapses, because it's not based on truth anymore. I'll give you one example. So do you guys know how the unicorn appeared in our universe? That's interesting. That's a good example of a dogma, okay, and how things are right. So when the first explorers went to the seas to find new places and all that, no one knew anything other than like a couple hundred miles away from the shores of Europe, right? So they went into this amazing journeys, and they found the narwhals. Narwhals, as some of you may know, like there's a whale. They have this gigantic horn-like structure right in the front of their heads, and they were jumping all over the boats because they were in the Arctic. You see a lot of them. At that time, you probably see way more than now. You don't see a lot now. And when they went back, they described this fantastic sea creature that had this unicorn in their heads, And that translated into a land creature that had the same type of magical powers with a horn in the head. And then that translated into, somehow, a horse that had the same horn in their head. So the unicorn was born. Religions is the same thing. Don't laugh. That's exactly how things started in religion, right? So I cannot understand how life starts. That's how religion. Okay, so going back in time, same way the explorers started a religion. I really have no idea how life starts. So I'm going to come up with a magical explanation for that. So my magical explanation is that somehow someone was created, and then it was like a magical scene that something, and then this individual was created as life, and then all these angels and angelic figures rolling around it and took like a rib cage of someone and moved into another person. That created another person, and then these two persons now inhabit the universe, and they all life started from these two individuals. How is that different from the Narwhals? That's exactly the same thing. The lack of understanding how life started created the writings of Eve and Adam. Right? That was the way they tried to figure out, is there some truth behind that? There's a little bit of truth here and there, just like the story of the Narwhals. There is a creature that has a unicorn in their head. There is one. But how that was interpreted over the time turned into this incredible story. That's the same thing how many religions explain the beginning of life. In a very magical way, with salt and pepper dots of truth here and there. Okay? How the universe started before the Big Bang Theory, no one knew. Something happened a few billion years ago, and we have no clue what happened. So let's create a story. So the story is that, remember that time they thought that the sky was actually water. That's what they believed at that time, because it was blue like just the sea. It was a reflection of the sea. So they believed there were the waters from above and the waters from below, and there's this earth, this existence in the middle. So that's when created this story about what we did. God created the universe in 7 days, and we know the story, how it happened, and how the water from above disappeared, and then, we know all this stuff. So that magical explanation for what happened is similar to the Narwhal story. A little bit of truth in certain aspects, of course written in a non-scientific way, obviously, but taken in a disproportionate interpretation of what happened and wrote into the magical story that turned into a dogma, because it's not scientifically evidence of things. I cannot challenge that, because if I take away that, my faith collapses together. So that's why faith and science and reason, they have to walk side by side all the time. So this is quite interesting, because Thomas Aquinas was the first person to write all that, and incredibly being accepted by his own religion. Not that he was proclaimed a saint, right? So, Spiritism, there's an interesting paper by Moreira Almeida in 2008. He talks about the qualitative methods in Spiritism and the framework to explain mediumistic phenomena. So, of course, it's not my goal to talk about scientific papers today, but it's interesting to understand that a lot of people now, including Moreira Almeida, Alexander from Brazil, Cesar from Juiz de Fora, revisiting the methods that Kardec created to evaluate the quality of the communications he was receiving, selecting them, curating them, and publishing in the books that we study, right? And there's actually a very nicely developed scientific approach to answer the questions that were raised by Kardec. The difference here is that Kardec asked the spirits. That's a type of observational study, right? And there's a long list of things. For example, he would question why illiterate mediums were writing in different languages. That's quite obvious. There's something else there, right? So writing with calligraphy, similar to the alleged communicating spirits. We know that now, like that happens every day in Spiritist centers. Painting, drawings, like poetry, xenoglossy, like in other words, you're speaking another language that you're not ever being exposed to. Certain things that were evaluated by Kardec when he was doing all his studies. So, and Kardec, of course, would ask the spirits directly the questions. He was not a medium himself. Remember that. Kardec was not an extensive medium. But he would ask, God, what is God? So what is God, right? It's the supreme intelligence, the first cause of all things. That cannot be more perfect, because he is the first cause of all things, but he's not he or she, or there's no gender here, and that's why God started in the very beginning. So God in the very beginning, the word God had no gender associated with it. It was a creator. Right? We can't define it. We can only define God by the principles that we know, like the perfection, and all of that. So, good example. So, and even in the question, so these are the first 8 questions of the Spirit's book. So, what proof we have of God? So, the axiom which you can apply to all scientific researches: there's no effect without a cause, and we know that. As simple as that. Okay. And now I'm just going to finish now with this is a passage from was received by the medium Chico Xavier. I'm just going to read to you guys because I think it really summarizes a lot of what we've been discussing today. Just give me 1 second. So faith in God does not keep away the inevitable trials, but give you the strength to support them. Faith do not move obstacles on the way. However, it will help you understand each one of them, and you may receive in silence a message they convey. Faith does not keep you from the disillusion and the disappointment that the word will trigger, but will help you learn the lessons they convey. Faith will not prevent your most fond companions from moving away during the journey. However, it will give you the energy and resources to replace them until other fellows show up and decide to support you. Faith will not prevent you from falling ill, and you may still need to go through this. However, it will enlighten you to understand and assimilate the message behind all that. Faith will not move your problematic relative away from you. However, it will help you accept and understand it in your own benefit. Faith will not save you from falls and difficulties during the way. However, it will teach you through your own pain which situations should be avoided for your own progress. Faith will not dismiss the problems that perhaps threaten your peace. However, it will give you the serenity to resolve them safely. Faith will not rescue from the maze of illusion which you might have thoughtlessly penetrated. However, will clarify your ideas so you can free yourself. Faith will not save you from falls and difficulties during the way. However, will teach you through your own pain. I said that. Finally, faith in God will not change the overall challenging scenario of evolution, but will instill patience in order for you to understand all the steps of elevation. Steps you need to climb to reach the highest level of imperishable life. And this is from the Spiritual Manual. The book's called Amigo. It's not translated. And from Chico Xavier. So, thank you very much. And we'll have some questions now, right?
Muito bem. Oh, English. All right. Thank you, Mark, for the lecture. It was great. We still have time. If anyone have any question or anyone watching us for the internet and want to make any comment or question, please go forward. And we have Carlos reading us for us. One at a time.
I'll do my question.
Yes.
We get faith.
Yeah.
We think we get rational.
Yeah.
But that word is under attack today.
Yeah.
Rationalism
Yeah.
was always based on a certain level of certainty on the facts.
Yeah.
Now we have alternative facts.
Oh.
We have fake news.
Right.
We don't know what fact is. We're dealing with very complex matters that often require us on a level of trust of other observers and not ourselves.
Yeah.
How would this change the way that we approach this discussion with someone who's not a Spiritist today?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that's the very first thing that Kardec writes in the Gospel According to Spiritism, is that it doesn't matter which context, it doesn't matter which, phenomena you're looking at, it doesn't matter which individual you're talking to. If you bring the moral aspects that God are giving to us, so the moral, they're preserved in every single mind of every individual in the universe. They may forget it and do it the other way, but it's still embedded in their minds. So if you think that, don't do unto others what they don't want people to do unto you, that's like a basic moral principle that cannot be challenged by any other way. There's no. So if you forget everything that we talked about today, but you believe that there's a set of moral rules of evolution that are coming from God in different religions at different times and point in life in the evolution. If you stick to those, then even your rational thinking cannot challenge anything, independently of who you're talking to, because those are preserved, those are conserved throughout all the population. And of course, I agree with you nowadays with the alternative facts creation, which is kind of interesting, that people can believe in whatever they want. Like, that's part of our own evolution, because another thing God gave to us so we can actually evolve ourselves is the ability to decide things ourselves. So we have our free will. Free will is the most powerful tool we have with us, by far. There's nothing else that compares to free will. It can do amazing good, or make you do things multiple times in a row until you figure it out, right? But you've made that decision, so you bear the responsibility. It's not your friend, it's not God, it's not Jesus, it doesn't matter, it's not anyone. You did, because of your free will, right? So that's the interesting point, because it doesn't matter what people create as alternative facts or discuss or fight over politics, whatever that is. You know that you go as far as you can, and you try to make the decisions according to the moral principles that you're taught. And that's how you show your faith. And that faith, based on moral principles, cannot be challenged by anything. That's rational. Right? And of course, I don't want to get into the three different concepts of rationalism, which are, I think, what you brought in the beginning. Because rationalism can be divided in the core essence of rationalism, which is like, I only believe if I can see and prove in a rational way. And then there's the religious rationalism, which is like, I can actually rationalize my own faith to make it stronger. And there's another philosophical aspect of rationalism, is that, I think, therefore I exist. That's the what context. So there's three different aspects of rationalism that I don't think is the topic of the talk today. But in general lines, if you think I'm thinking about each one of you, and I'm not thinking about collectivist religions, but if every individual thinks about what they do believe, and they try to resolve their own issues with faith, that's the single most important step you do towards shining that light on your path. That's what Leon Denis said, right? And getting away that glare of fog that you're surrounded all the time. Right?
And what I find is that it may have been true at Kardec's time that most people were blind to faith because they were kind of based on the dogmas. But today we find across all the religions, there's a lot of more rationale thought around it. Yeah. Now, then we have to agree or disagree with the rationale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's much more difficult than disagreeing with a dogma. So we just have to be careful if we are talking with non-spiritists. Mm-hmm. Don't call their faith blind. No. Right? Don't, or even kind of, say that it's silly, it's unproven, and whatever, because people say that about spiritism as well.
Yes.
All the time.
Yeah, and that's what I said. That every person have to look inside your own self, because we should never remember we're not the bearer of truth either, because we don't even know how much information is available. So Spiritism may know a little bit about things that the Spiritists brought to us here and there. So a lot of Spiritists, for example, think that the spiritual city that's described by Andrea Luiz, Nosso Lar, is like the utmost evolution hub in the universe. sorry to disappoint you. It's like a tiny little city sitting above our tiny little planet in this, which is like a tiny representation of our own universe still. It's far away from perfection. It's like light years away from understanding what actually spiritual world is. We have this, we're looking through this keyhole, right, in the spiritual universe. So that's what Joe is saying. Do never ever consider ourselves like as the bearer of the truth in spiritual religious evolution. We're not.
In the same way that we are receiving message, right? The other religions are receiving,
exactly the same way.
People message that is improving. Right? We can see the new pope, right?
Yeah.
How many
That's a
look
perfect
us to
example.
him and they say, "Wow, this new pope is being something new."
Yeah.
And I was in on another church with a friend, and they're talking things that we would discuss here as well. So the same way that Spiritism on our own path, we're growing and learning more every day. The other religions are doing that as well, right? It's just different level of understanding, different way of practicing that, but they are receiving those messages.
Yeah, and the moral principles are preserved. That's what the interesting thing. So that those cannot ever be challenged because they're actually tucked in our conscience when we come in. Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much, everyone. We're gonna start getting prepared. Thank you,
Yes.
Michael. We're gonna start getting prepared for the passes. I want to thank you guys for the internet who's watching us, and hope to see you guys again next week, or maybe during our studies on Wednesday and Thursday. Thank you.